From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Before the election, when I was travelling around the country on the campaign trail, something I'd hear all the time, and this is voters from Arizona to Wyoming, people would talk about immigration. They would say there's too many people coming over the border, the country's filling up, was something I'd hear about all the time. And this wasn't just from Republicans. This was from Republicans and Democrats. Even if you were living in a state that was thousands of miles away from the border, there was still this idea that there was a big national security risk because of large numbers of people who were crossing illegally over the border from Mexico. So this kept coming up. And this was something that Donald Trump has obviously talked about a lot during the election campaign.
I will end the illegal immigration crisis by closing our border and finishing the wall, most of which I've already built. We have to stop the invasion into our country that's killing hundreds of thousands of people a year.
And something that the Democrats have kind of had to face up to the fact that the number of people crossing over the border was really high. And so they then this summer enacted these executive orders.
To protect America as a land that welcomes immigrants, we must first secure the border and secure it now.
President Joe Biden announcing that migrants entering at the U.S.-Mexico border will no longer be granted asylum if there's a surge in crossings.
And really, really reduced the number of people crossing, but it was too late.
The Story today. Inside Trump's mass deportation blueprint.
My name's Louise Callaghan, and I'm the senior US correspondent for the Sunday Times.
Louise, the last time we spoke, it was 3 a.m. here in London. It was election night. You were near Mar-a-Lago, but not quite in Mar-a-Lago. Since then, I know you've managed to swing the golden invite. For people who haven't made it past the gates, just describe what Mar-a-Lago is like. What does it even look like?
So it's this huge pink palace.
Pink.
It's pink, kind of candy floss pink, right on the sea. It's on Palm Beach, which is an island in Florida. This is very, very kind of wealthy. I think it's something like 50 billionaires live on the island. It's a lot of, incredibly wealthy, elderly people living on this tiny island in Florida. And among them is Donald Trump, who's made it his home since the mid-'80s. And so Mar-a-Lago is this huge, huge, huge palace, and it's like a private members club. So you walk in and it has these big kind of gold and black wrought iron gates. Don't know what the word is. Opulent, I suppose. It's astounding. It's a sort of like walking into the Sistine Chapel, but it's in Florida and full of billionaires. It's really high ceilings, like marble columns, frescoes over all the walls, and there's this beautiful soft lighting, kind of church-like lighting. And it's just full of these people who adore Trump. When I went in there for dinner last week on Friday night, we were all sitting down, and then this applause starts in the distance from the other side of the dining room. And I didn't really know what was going on. And then everyone started standing up. And then eventually the applause gets louder. Everyone starts kind of clapping and whooping. And then he walks in, and he's standing right next to me, sort of, like half a foot away or something, like pretty much shoulder to shoulder. And he's just basking in this adoration, and everyone's shouting at him, "You're the best president ever," and clapping and shaking his hand, and the occasional people kind of asking him for favors as he walks through. It's very much, he's the king at his court, and you can just tell he loves this. This is his house, and
is this how he lives every night?
Pretty much. For the last 4 years, he's been ensconced here with his advisors, plotting his return, writing executive orders, sending off tweets. He famously hates Washington, hates being there. Mar-a-Lago, this is his place, Everyone loves him. He gets to have his favorite overdone steak, like with lots of ketchup on the side. And really, this is just genuinely what he loves doing. Like he just thinks it's fantastic.
And you mentioned that the fawning crowds, the people who pay huge amounts of money just to be near him at Mar-a-Lago. Just describe some of the people you met there.
I spent the week in Palm Beach reporting on the election, and obviously I really wanted to get inside Mar-a-Lago to get a kind of front row seat at his court. And so I spoke to a number of people who were members, and eventually I started speaking to a lady called Toni Holt-Kramer, who's the head of a group called Trumpets USA.
Trumpets?
Trumpets. They're these kind of group of high society ladies, and they have for years just been using their influence to support him and to try and in their view, get the word out on what a wonderful president he is. So I spoke to her, and she very, very kindly invited me to dinner at Mar-a-Lago with her and some of her friends. And at the table next to us, there's Roger Stone, who's one of his closest advisors, also a convicted felon whose sentence Trump commuted when he was in office. There's Laura Loomer, who's a 9/11 truther, as in she doesn't believe that 9/11 happened. She's a conspiracy theorist.
Wow.
She's been a big part of his campaign recently. She's been traveling around with him. There's his son, Eric, and his wife, Lara, who's played a really major role in his re-election. So it's kind of all of his associates, all of his courtiers sitting there in the club to spend time with him, to be close to him, and also to plan for the transition.
And a lot of people there will be, the courtiers will be hoping for a role in the new administration. We are now starting to get a sense of who might be part of that group. We've got a couple of the first appointments, in particular, the man the Trump team are calling the new border czar. Tell us a bit about him.
Well, Trump has just said that Tom Homan will be the new border czar. And he's a really interesting character. He used to be head of ICE, which is the US body which kind of controls the border, essentially, and who comes over it. And he left ICE during the kind of scandal in Trump's last term regarding the separation of children from their families when they cross the border.
A new directive by the Trump administration, zero tolerance, is to prosecute all such migrants criminally, which means by law, parents and children must be separated. The directive to prosecute has sparked broad outrage from Democrats and some prominent Republicans.
You'll probably remember it was a really big deal at the time, and it was condemned by a lot of human rights groups as being unfair and abusive to children.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places. We can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch.
What kind of happened after that is that Tom Homan's been sort of waiting in the wings, like a lot of these Trump allies, during the Biden years as they, repealed a lot of Trump's policies. And then now these policies are coming back. I mean, now they're all returning. So I spoke to Homan, just kept calling him, and I eventually got through to him on Friday afternoon. He was very harried. And so Homan is going to be a big part of what Trump has called the biggest deportation scheme in history. And so what they're saying, and this is, of course, you can kind of put some of this down to Trumpian exaggeration, but I think they are very serious about it. They want to deport everyone who is in the US illegally. And that is between 11 and 20 million people. No one knows exactly how many people are in the US illegally.
That's a huge number.
Yeah, and no one has ever done that before. In the modern world, where we are at the moment, it's not really possible to round up 20 million people in a democracy and deport them. The entire prison population of the US, which is one of the biggest prison populations in the world, is still less than 2 million. In an average year, they usually deport about 500,000 people. And they're mostly people who are caught crossing the border and then deported after their asylum claim is rejected.
That's 500,000. They want to go instantly to about 11 million.
Right.
If not more.
Quite aside from any kind of, human rights concerns that people might have, it would just require this kind of completely unheard of effort to do this. And it would obviously face challenges in various state courts. But on the other hand, Trump, the Republicans basically won the Senate, he's won the presidency. It looks like the Republicans might win the House as well. So he will have really significant latitude to do this. And when I spoke to Tom Homan on Friday, it seemed like he was incredibly serious about it. And he said, look, bottom line, if you're in the country illegally, then you're on the list. You're likely to be deported, or that there is a possibility that you'll be deported. He said, though, that they would go for, I quote, the worst of the worst first. And by that, presumably, he means people who've committed crimes.
And that's something he's talked about before, publicly, in interviews.
This deportation operation, the priorities are going to be public safety threats and national security threats. They will be the priorities. And no one should be pushing back against removing a public safety threat from the streets of this country and protecting our citizens.
How would they even begin to carry these deportations out? I mean, what is their plan? How do they physically do it?
Well, already there is an infrastructure for this to happen. Like all states deport people who cross in illegally or who've failed asylum interviews or things like that, or who've committed crimes and cancelled their visas. I mean, this is an existing thing that happens. It's just about expanding it. So what Homan spoke about last week is expanding the use of the military to build holding facilities that people can be held in before they're deported, expanding the use of the military to transport migrants from one place to another. And then, of course, there's the question of, will their countries take them back if they're deported? Because this has been a really big issue with Venezuela. The Venezuelan leadership has said many times that they're not going to take back deportees from the US. And when I asked Homan about that, well, he just said, well, that's the benefit of having what he categorized as a strong president. He thinks that Trump will just be able to kind of force them to do it, by slapping tariffs on goods or by taking away aid money and things like that. So I think they're very much envisaging kind of, strongman like realpolitik here, pushing neighbouring countries or countries in the region to comply with these US policies or else.
And they seem to be dusting off some very old laws to try and enforce this.
So there's a 200-year-old law that basically allows the US to deport people who are citizens of a country that the US is at war with, which Trump has talked about dusting off to try and get this done.
And I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Think of that. 1798. This was put there. 1798. That's a long time ago, right? To target and dismantle every migrant criminal network operating on American soil. We will send...
Also, of course, he's controlling large parts of the government. He can use his executive orders. I mean, he can just kind of move ahead with this. And if there are blue states on the border, for example, California, New Mexico, who object to this, then Stephen Miller, one of his top advisors on this, has just said that, well, they can just send the National Guard from friendly states. So whether that's Texas or, or Florida, or, they can send National Guard from other states to try and carry this out.
And in order to fund it too, there's talk of even calling a state of emergency. Just explain how that would work.
If you call a state of emergency on the first day in office, then it would allow you to kind of widen your use of executive powers in order to get this done. You could kind of redirect parts of the Pentagon budget towards paying for this. It would allow him to act with these kind of executive powers very quickly and to redirect funding in order to solve this. What happens a lot with Trump is that he says stuff that sounds really, really extreme. And then people who don't like him kind of say, well, what is this? What is this absolutely mad stuff he's saying, and take it very seriously. And then people who support him, they quite often say, well, don't take it seriously. This is just rhetoric for effect. But with this one, I think like those closest to him, including his advisor, Stephen Miller, Tom Homan, all of these people, they're saying, no, take this seriously. This is happening.
Louise, you've just been telling us about the man Trump's making his border czar, a man you've spoken to. We know that Trump has some pretty controversial things to say about immigration. It's something he's talked about in every rally. What's the truth in America, though? I mean, you've been crossing the country in the run-up to this election. How serious a problem is illegal immigration?
Well, about a year ago, arrivals in the US of people crossing illegally over the border peaked. They were really high. There were about, I think in December last year, there was about 300,000 people who had encounters with border guards, which is kind of a rough measure of how many people are trying to cross over. And the US asylum system had been overwhelmed. This much was really clear. You know, people were crossing over, having a very brief interview with the border guards, and then they say, okay, well, you're possibly at risk of persecution. Here's your asylum trial date. That's in 3 years. In the meantime, you're free to go and possibly work as well. Let's be clear, there were large numbers of people arriving. That number has now dropped after Biden issued a number of executive orders on the border. What is different, though, is the way that the Republicans are categorizing this. So throughout the campaign, the things that Trump kept talking about, it was, okay, on one hand, yes, there are large numbers of people coming over. That's fair enough to say. But on the other hand, he kept talking about something that he calls migrant crime.
And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer.
There's this idea that the people who are crossing over are committing large numbers of crimes. And this is just not true. This is absolutely untrue. So undocumented migrants statistically are much less likely than US citizens to commit crimes. But there were these kind of prominent cases of, you know, times where undocumented migrants had raped American women, which were picked up by the Trump campaign, particularly the case of Laken Riley.
Just 1 week ago, a beautiful 22-year-old nursing student from Georgia was barbarically attacked while she was out on her morning run. She was doing keep herself in shape. The monster that charged in the death is an illegal alien migrant who was led into our country and released into our communities by crooked Joe Biden. He's crooked.
And so they're very much kind of concentrating on this idea that these are, you know, like terrible people. I mean, Trump said in 2016, I think, that they were rapists coming over from Mexico. It's less a kind of discussion about, okay, numbers are up, what are we going to do about it? And more this idea that they're bad people who are coming over. And then the numbers of people who are living illegally in the US, no one really knows how many people live here illegally, but it's somewhere between 11 and 20 million people. If you're going to try and deport all of those, you kind of need a reason why. And so this idea that they're criminals is something that the Trump administration has used to kind of, you know, enforce that.
And Louise, I mean, those numbers are startling, 11 to 20 million. How has America got there? You know, what's happened over the last few presidencies to get to a number as big as that?
Well, 8 million migrants have entered the US illegally since Biden came to power in 2020. So, I mean, there's really large numbers of people we're talking about.
Yeah.
But there have always been, I mean, compared to, say, like the UK or like many countries in Europe, there have always been a large number of people living illegally in the US. And, you know, US agriculture depends on these people as well. Half of US agricultural workers are undocumented. And the fact that there are so many undocumented migrants in the US agricultural sector also means that their products are competitively priced. That keeps labor costs down. So it's been allowed to exist for a very long time.
So there's sort of been an acceptance of it over years. And then suddenly it really has peaked under Biden. Why is that?
Yeah, it absolutely has peaked under Biden. So there have been a number of reasons behind that. And one is that during the pandemic, Trump issued executive orders that basically shut down the border, basically kind of used the pandemic as an excuse to say, well, no one can come in and we're completely shutting it down. They also had a program called Remain in Mexico, where if you were seeking asylum, you had to remain in Mexico until the outcome of the asylum case was decided. And then Biden, when he came into power, he repealed all of these things. Word got round, and then people started crossing in really high numbers. That meant that the asylum system was overwhelmed, that it was taking years and years for people to have their asylum cases heard. I mean, it still is. They haven't fixed it. So after that, this spring, it was getting really out of hand. I was working down by the border then. The numbers were really up. The Democrats had sort of realized how bad this was and how politically damaging this was. And then they, working with the Republicans, they negotiated this bipartisan deal that would have really just changed a lot of things on the border. It would have dramatically increased the amount of staff. It really would have, cut down on all of this, on the numbers of people crossing. And then Trump basically torpedoed it, told Republicans not to vote for it. So, yes, the Democrats, I think even the Democrats will openly admit that they left it too late. But also the Republicans did torpedo their attempts to fix it. So this summer, then Biden issued an executive order basically shutting down the border, kind of doing what Trump did before. And ever since then, numbers have fallen dramatically. I mean, the numbers crossing now are sort of less than a third of the ones who were crossing in December last year. I mean, they're still high, but it's on a downward trend.
Yeah.
And now I think part of Trump's strategy in being so vocal and talking so constantly about how they're going to close down the border is A, in order to enact that, but B, to kind of spread the word around that you can't come to the US anymore. They're hoping that this will filter through to people who might be choosing to travel to the US. Don't come, you're not welcome here.
And Trump's big plan, his pledge to fix this, it's not just to close the border and stop new people coming, it's actually to actively deport millions of people. I mean, how much does it cost to deport millions of people?
I mean, no one actually knows because no one's done this before, but there's a pro-migration campaign group that estimated that doing the first part of this, beginning this, would cost about $315 billion.
$315 billion. That is insane.
Yeah.
Do they think it'll benefit the economy in any way? Because that's a huge cost to the American people.
Yeah, look, I mean, most mainstream economists believe that immigration is most significant as a driver of economic growth rather than a drag on social spending. But the Republicans very much say, when I spoke to Homan last week, I said, well, come on, this is going to be so expensive. How are you going to do it? And he said, well, you talk about it being expensive, but at the end of the day, we're saving so much money on, housing for undocumented migrants or medical care. And that's a very attractive kind of piece of rhetoric, even though it's not necessarily true. Migration benefits an economy usually, then it's a kind of an attractive idea to people who've really suffered.
Well, on that, because we know that immigration does tend to help the economy, what impact would it have if they did deport millions of people? I mean, you talked about the agricultural sector, for example. Would this actually add to inflation?
Enormously, yeah. I mean, if you deport half the people who are in charge of, picking oranges in Florida or, working fields in California, that's going to cause a huge spike in global food prices. It's going to really, really cost the consumer. And so I suspect that at some point before they start hitting large numbers of agricultural workers in states like Florida, then I would assume that Trump's great allies who are running these big global food consortiums would try and decrease the impact. But I think even the fear of deportation is going to put a lot of people off traveling over for seasonal labor. A lot of people will cross from Central America into Mexico into the US, work for a season in Florida and then cross back over. Given that they're not also expanding pathways for people to do that legally, then this is going to be, I think, a real problem coming up. Because the US economy thrives off the fact that they can live off undocumented labor, pay people very little because they don't need to contribute to their social security payments and things like that. So getting rid of that would cause a huge price shock, which would impact consumers in the US and across the world.
And Louise, when you were travelling around the country, I mean, what were people saying about these plans? And what sort of responses it had since he's actually declared his border czar and we think it is full steam ahead?
What's really interesting, actually, is when you speak to voters, especially I spoke to a lot of Hispanic voters in the run-up to these elections. Many of them were voting for Trump. And so I'd bring this up because a lot of people that they're in the US legally, or they came as children illegally and have since then got citizenship. But a lot of people that I spoke to who are in the US legally and who are voting for Trump and they're US citizens, they nonetheless, they have family members who are in the US illegally or who want to come over illegally, or, this is kind of part of their community that they live among. They have that. And so quite a few times I would ask, well, you're not worried that they're going to be deported? And there's this kind of general idea, I think, that oh, he's just exaggerating, or it probably won't happen to me. Or I remember I was speaking to a Mexican-American woman in Pennsylvania who, she didn't like Haitians, and she kind of thought that applied more to Haitians than it would to Mexicans coming over. People kind of talk around it a bit and think it won't happen to them, think it won't happen to their family, think he wasn't serious. And then so I think the reality of this is going to hit home pretty soon. I mean, he's saying he will do this, and I think it's At this point, we have to start taking what Trump says seriously. He's saying he's going to move ahead with it and that this is his plan and that he's going to move on it from day one. So, it's coming whether people expect it to or not.
You can read Louise's full interview with the next border czar, as well as her adventures at Mar-a-Lago and all of her coverage of the aftermath of the American election at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Taryn Siegel and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If there's any angle of American politics that you'd like us to be covering in the next few weeks, do get in touch. You can email us at thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.